1946. Journalist Rebecca West finds herself in the city of Nuremberg, or rather what's left of it. It is the middle of summer and the city stinks to high heaven. It had been gradually bombed to pieces during the war, and after a while the local authorities, completely overwhelmed, gave up on retrieving those buried beneath the rubble. And so, when summer arrived, the stench suffocated the city, a nauseating reminder of those who lay there. Once a magnificent city, Nuremberg looks like a wasteland. Rubble, rats, rags, dust, debris, despair. Most of the trees which had survived that last apocalyptic bombing raid in 1945 had been cut down by the population, desperate to survive the harsh winter. After death passed through the flaming streets on its pale horse, famine had climbed up on the ruins and delighted in its triumph. It is a bad time to be a German. It's as if all those pockets of death and misery and suffering the National Socialists had created during the war had swollen, burst out, and splattered the country like acid. There is no food, no electricity, no coal, just a vast moonscape of nothingness and sorrow. The German men seem to be afflicted by a strange malady. They don't walk with their backs straight anymore, and they don't talk, they whisper. A whole nation's immune system sent into shock by defeat. West, by her real name Cicely Isabel Fairfield, was there on a mission. She was to bear witness to one of the most important trials in modern history. Fascism was on the dock. The task at hand was not easy. Nothing like this had ever been done before. There was a lack of precedent and no lack of complications. The victorious countries all had different legal systems. Working together with Russia was a challenge, to say the least. The city itself was in extremely poor shape, and organizing everything was a logistical nightmare. There was not enough fuel or rooms for the participants. The roads needed repairs, there was not enough staff. And the Allies were exhausted. Victory had come at a steep price. Nobody had walked away from the catastrophe that was the Second World War without a metaphorical limp. We think of these trials as historically significant. Today, ordinary people pass quietly through the courtroom where they took place, taking in the sight, looking at those empty chairs, perhaps trying to go back in time and imagine how it would have felt to be there in person. History in the making. One retired US Army colonel from Missouri I met in Nuremberg, who visited the courthouse as part of a tour, told me how important the moment had been for him. To be able to stand so close to where Hermann Göring had stood and had to answer for what he had done. I suppose that if I had to imagine being there, in my mind I would have had the attention of a hawk. How could I not? It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. So it was surprising to read that boredom often reigned in the courthouse. People were zoning out, tapping their feet in the air, nodding off, sometimes outright falling into a snoring sleep. On the day of the sentencing, those unfortunate enough to fall asleep found themselves shaken awake by the guards, who were not only tasked with maintaining security, but also with making sure that nobody infringed on the solemnity of the proceedings by taking a nap while history played out in front of them. But there was more to that boredom than meets the eye. It was a heavy feeling, tinged with impatience. Because as it turns out, nobody truly wanted to be there. It was perhaps unexpected. After all, this victory had been ardently desired, and beating the Germans had become a goal imbued with almost sacred qualities. And after light was shed on what had been really happening in the concentration camps and what the Einsatzgruppen had been doing, there was a general feeling of disbelief and rage. One American soldier by the name of Norman Nichols, who took part in the liberation of the Gunskirchen camp, wrote that the half-crazed, starving Jews were so glad to see the Americans, they kissed the hands of embarrassed, nauseated Yanks who came away from the scenes of Nazi horror with an almost irresistible desire to shoot every German soldier on sight. Well, now was the time for payback. As that little song goes, vengeance victorious, these are the glorious days. And yet, in her 1946 essay, Greenhouse with Cyclamen, Part 1, West writes the following. It might seem that this is only to say that at Nuremberg people were bored, but this was a boredom on a huge historic scale. A machine was running down, a great machine, the greatest machine that has ever been created, the war machine, by which mankind, in spite of its infirmity of purpose and its frequent desire for death, has defended its life. It was a hard machine to operate. It was the natural desire of all who served it that it should become scrap. There was another machine which was warming up, the peace machine, by which mankind lives its life. All over the world, people were sick with impatience because they were bound to the machine that was running down, and they wanted to be among the operators of the machine that was warming up. The men on the dock might have been imprisoned and left alone with their conscience in their cells every night, but the trial imprisoned all its participants. The accused could not move on with their lives, but neither could the men who guarded them, nor the typists who typed up the words, twittering unhappily in their glass box like cage birds kept awake by a bright light, nor the journalists who came to that courtroom day after day to witness the proceedings. They were all trapped there, a year after the misery that was World War II had ended, unable to move forward, pausing their lives. West describes it in vivid terms, the water torture, boredom falling drop by drop on the same water spot on the soul. She saw it as the continued enslavement of the war machine. They all wanted to sprint to the peace machine and lunge full speed into the future, leaving behind them the proof that humans are, after all, the worst of species. It was a means of collective survival. The people in the courthouse submitted to this delay out of a myriad of reasons, ranging from professional, the journalists were probably hoping to get a valuable scoop, to a need for justice, a sense of duty, the establishment of a precedent, and hopefully deterrent, and a sort of ritual purification of Germany. They considered it necessary for the moral health of the country to see these once untouchable men having to answer for their crimes. In her essay, West makes extensive notes and meditations on the legal aspects, the morality and flaws of the trials. The trials themselves had many critics even back then, with notable voices coming from around the world, including countries among the victors, such as the US, where much ink was spilled discussing this matter back and forth in law school papers. The Allies were accused of taking revenge on their vanquished foes while hiding under the banners of justice. They were accused of judging the men on the dock without a clear, pre-existing legal basis. Even Bernard D. Meltzer, professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School and prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials, wrote in his paper a note on the Nuremberg debate. There is one criticism in the current debate which is more troublesome. It is, in my judgment, the central difficulty of Nuremberg. The governing law has not been equally applied. The standards of guilt have been applied only to the enemy. They have not been applied to our allies or to ourselves. The Russians are not forced to defend their operations in Finland or Poland. We are not required to justify Hiroshima. The barbarity of the Nazis and the fact that it was their aggression which unleashed a whole chain of horrors strengthens our relative moral position. But while this justifies the actual application of a unilateral standard at Nuremberg, it cannot conceal the imperfect character of such a standard. Even before Meltzer had put these words to paper, West had already addressed his point and many of the criticisms in a thundering paragraph. Those who loved the trial for the law's sake also found the course of their love running not too smoothly. This was not because they were uncomfortably impressed by the arguments brought forward by the declared opponents of the Nuremberg prosecutions. None of these was really effective when set against the wholeness of the historical crisis which had provoked it. It was absurd to say that the defendants were tried for ex post facto, when the Bryan-Kellogg Pact of 1928 had made aggressive warfare a crime by renouncing the use of war as an instrument of policy. And it was notable that even those opponents who had a special insight into that pact, because they had helped to frame it, were unable to meet this point, save by pleading that it had not been designed to be used as a basis for the prosecution of war criminals. But that plea was invalid, for in 1928 the necessary conditions for such prosecutions did not exist. There was then no country that seemed likely to wage war which was not democratic in its government, since the only totalitarian powers in Europe, the Soviet Union and Italy, was still weak. It would not be logical to try the leaders of a democracy for their governmental crimes, since they had been elected by the people, who thereby took the responsibility for all their actions. If a democracy breaks the Bryan-Kellogg Pact, it must pay by taxation and penalties that fall on the whole people. But the leaders of a totalitarian state seize political power and continually declare that they, and not the people, are responsible for all governmental acts. And if these be crimes according to the international law, their claims to responsibility must make them subject to trial before what tribunal international law decrees. This argument is so much in accordance with reality that, in the courtroom itself, it was never doubted. All the defendants, with one exception, seemed to think that the Allies were right in indicting not the German people, but the officers and instruments of the Nazi government, for conspiring together to commit crimes against peace and the rules of war and humanity. And in most cases their line of defense was that not they, but Hitler or some other members of the party had taken the actual decision which led to these crimes. This line of defense, by its references to Hitler alone, concedes the basis of the Nuremberg Trials. The one dissenter who would not make this concession was Schacht, who behaved as if there had been a democratic state superimposed on the Nazi state, and that this had been the scene of his activities. In spite of this, even she concedes that there was reason for shame, as she put it, in allowing a Soviet judge to sit on the bench, in light of the Soviet Union's actions during the war. She answers this by pointing out that the expectation that the judges all belong to neutral powers was virtually impossible to fulfill. In her mind, there was no country that could objectively not be influenced by one of the victorious powers. Could a Swedish judge, she ponders, have dared to give a verdict that upset the Soviet Union? Could a Mexican judge have dared to do anything that risks souring their relationship with their northern neighbor, the United States? This was not to say that fear would have been the only motivator. Countries can also have beneficial, profitable relationships. What country could have been counted upon to risk displeasing or severing a beneficial relationship with one or more members of the Allied powers? It is a question worth pondering. West concludes that there had to be a trial cannot be doubted. It was not only that common sense could predict that if the Nazis were allowed to go free, the Germans would not have believed in the genuineness of the Allies' expressed disapproval of them, and that the good Germans would have been cast down in spirit, while the bad Germans would have wondered how long they needed to wait for the fun and jobbery to start again. A gaping hole would have appeared in our moral system had it been possible for villains to commit a vast number of vile crimes in their own and other countries, and to escape punishment because they had created ruin so general that it had consumed all courts of law. Civilization could no longer have been regarded as a viable idea if Dr. Frank, the governor of Poland, could not be punished for breaking Polish laws simply because he had murdered Poland, and the corpse was incapable of prosecuting him. For West, and for many others, perfect was not to be allowed to be the enemy of good. A trial had to take place. The purification it promised was worth the accusations flung at the International Military Tribunal. It was a means of collective survival. So there she was, in Nuremberg, month after month. She was in awe of the sheer loveliness of the German countryside, of the masterful gardening skills of the average German, of the patience and discipline they poured into their green spaces, where the boxes of crimson flowers bursting magnificently from windows, or a proper fairy tale garden laced with blushing roses and fragrant honeysuckle and tall, hugely round sunflowers, a respite from the world. It was difficult to make peace between the image of the patient gardener, an artist in overalls and straw hat, and those screaming men in uniform with their black boots and black hearts. She was not the only one who seemed troubled by the contrast. A French doctor who testified at the trial regarding a lampshade of human origin put it best when he said to West, "These people where I live, they send me in my breakfast tray strewn with pansies, beautiful pansies. I have never seen more beautiful pansies arranged with exquisite taste. I have to remind myself that they belong to the same race that supplied me with my exhibits, the same race that tortured me month after month, year after year at Mauthausen." While clearly enchanted by the splendors of the German countryside, West was not equally impressed by its cities. In her opinion, Germany was too fond of overbuilding. Everything from furniture to houses seemed overly grand, needlessly elaborate to her. The impracticality of a turret on a villa, the grossly ornamented mansions in Berlin, all the wastes of masonry, as she called it, seemed to irk her taste. She suspected the Germans of having, quote, an excessive preoccupation for fairy tales, even though she cannot help but furnish her readers with lavish descriptions of interiors down to the smallest details. She even went as far as to theorize that this aesthetic preference caused quite a bit of trouble for Germany. I quote, "For the German passion for overbuilding must have done much to bring the Nazis to power. It engendered high taxation and a quicksand instability in the financial structure of Germany, and it laid on German industry and commerce an obligation to pay their executives on a scale excessive by the standards of any other European country. It also meant an increasing burden on municipal finances, for the multiplication of villas standing in their own large grounds meant that the water and gas and electricity and sewage systems had to cover an extended area, and that transport and the upkeep of roads were a larger problem. Although I don't know enough about Germany's pre-World War II economy to make a judgment on the merits of this curious theory, I wanted to share it with you and ask for your thoughts on this. Those of you who do know more about the topic, do you agree with West here? When they're not in the courtroom, the spectators pass the time by going on drives, having affairs, exploring the German countryside, counting down the days until their duty has been fulfilled and they can rejoin the machine of peace. The trial's monotony is occasionally broken, either by some horrific witness testimony or, strangely enough, by the sheer oddity of the Russians. The rest of the Allies have an uneasy cooperation with them, and they arise from West's story looking like somewhat of a black sheep. "It seems to me, when I look back on the last few months," said one of the journalists who sat through the whole trial, "that again and again I have seen the Russians do the most mysterious things. I don't think I dreamed that one of the leading Russian lawyers, all togged up in his military uniform, stepped up to the rostrum and squared his shoulders as if he were going to do some weightlifting and shouted at whatever defendant it was in the box. 'Did you conspire to wage an aggressive war against the peace-loving democracies? Answer yes or no.' When the defendant said, 'No,' the Russian lawyer thought for a long time and said, 'I accept your answer. I cannot work that one out.' The men in the dock did not try." It's almost comical to imagine all the other judges and prosecutors being solemn and taking this very seriously, and then you have the Russians starring in a slapstick comedy. Must have given quite the whiplash to the accused. Speaking of them, to West we owe some of the most enduring descriptions of the men on the dock. In her eyes, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and the highest-ranking National Socialist in that courtroom, had something in his mannerisms that reminded one of the madam of a brothel. Or, thanks to his coarse, bright skin of an actor who has used grease paint for years and the preternaturally deep wrinkles of the drug addict, he looked strangely like a ventriloquist dummy. Baldur von Schirach, head of the youth education, had the airs of a neat and mousy governess. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, director of the Reich Security main office, looked like a vicious horse. Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer, was plainly mad with ashen skin and often contorting his body in strained, unnatural positions. They sat there day after day going through the motions, protesting their innocence, and each time they became less and less. The bright, clinical lights shining down on them, lights so strong that some of the accused requested sunglasses, were slowly beginning to wash away their personal traits. It was as if color was bleeding out of them, and by the time of the sentencing, they were all shadows of their former selves. It became strange to think that they once held so much power. What surprised me the most when it came to the sentencing was that, in the days before the event, West reports that the judges and their families, and many of those who had been at the trials, appeared to be not just somber, but downright sad. Curious feeling to have in this situation. One would expect perhaps a feeling of triumph, or schadenfreude, or at least a coldness. After all, they had laid bare before the world what those men had done. Their outrage must have been fearsome. Yet West explains that if a trial for murder lasts too long, more than the murder will out. The man in the murderer will out. It becomes horrible to think of destroying him. The day of the sentencing was a day of mixed emotions: anger, relief, resignation, outrage, and most unexpectedly, humor. The defendants never failed to find the judge's mispronunciation of their names funny. It was an odd thing, considering the circumstances, but they were desperate for a scrap of a smile, a sliver of laughter, a drop of amusement. They found the acquittals terribly funny. Göring laughed when Schacht was pronounced a free man. The press was forbidden from photographing the defendants while they were being sentenced. For when society has to hurt a man, it must hurt him as little as possible and must preserve what it can of his pride, lest there should spread in that society those feelings which make men do the things for which they get hanged, warns West. 12 death sentences, 3 life sentences, 4 long prison terms, 3 acquittals. Even the sentencing was not without controversy. West, and according to her many, if not all the judges, thought that Hess was not fit to stand trial, and gives the following alarming description of his reaction on the day of his sentencing. All humanity left his face. It became an agonized muzzle. He began to swing backwards and forwards on his seat with the regularity of a pendulum. His head swung forward almost to his knees. His skin became blue. If one could pity Ribbentrop and Göring, then that was the time. They had to sit listening to the judgment upon them, while a lunatic swayed and experienced a nameless evil in the seat beside them. She mentions how most of the psychiatrists consulted by the court had declared him fit to stand trial. If Hess was faking it, it certainly was an Oscar-worthy performance. Some members of the audience were furious with the sentences. That only the Gestapo, SD, and SS were declared to be criminal organizations was seen as an outrageous sign of weakness. To let organizations such as the SA off the hook was felt by many to be akin to a betrayal. Photographs might have been forbidden, but West leaves us with something more powerful: a haunting description of the defendants' reactions to hearing their death sentences. It must be recorded that there was not a coward among them. Even Ribbentrop, who was white as a stone because of his terror, and Kaltenbrunner, who looked like a vicious horse and gave no promise of restraint, bowed quietly to the bench. Frank, the governor of Poland, he who had repented and had become a good Catholic and wore black glasses more constantly than any of the others, gave an odd proof of his complete perturbation. He lost his sense of direction and stood with his back to the bench until he was spun round by the guards. But then he listened courageously enough to his sentence of death. All but Streicher had intelligence quotients far above the average, and most of them had not been unfavored in their circumstances. We learned what they did beyond all doubt, and that is the great achievement of the Nuremberg trial. No literate person can now pretend that these men were anything but abscesses of cruelty. But we learn nothing about them that we did not know before, except that they were capable of heroism to which they had no moral right, and that there is nothing in the legend that a bully is always a coward. The organization of the trials was a shoddy affair. West reports how young guards squinted uncertainly at passes in a poorly lit hallway, failed to recognize key figures such as, let's say, the judges, and overall were quite ineffective. Long coats, briefcases and handbags were forbidden, which was quite annoying for the women because even back then suits did not have large enough pockets to carry everything they might need, forcing them to stuff pencils and spectacle cases in places such as their bras. Surprisingly, nobody seems to have been searched, which is how one French journalist who was wearing an old padded jacket in light on the ban on long coats discovered a small loaded revolver in the holster pocket. She had stored it there while on assignment in Asia and forgotten about it until that day. West is however lenient about this, pointing out the lack of available security personnel and that even if there had been enough policemen, housing, feeding and transporting them would have been a logistical nightmare in ruined Nuremberg, and how the novelty of the situation made it difficult to find someone who had experience in running this kind of operation. Nothing on this scale had ever been done before. In her words, this was a business badly done, but it could have been done no better. As I see it, the greatest success for Nuremberg was that it confronted the accused with the consequences of their actions. Those men sat in their plush offices, well insulated from the reality of that their words created. They didn't have to watch the father who stroked his little son's head and said something to him as the shadows of the German rifles stretched towards them like spears. They didn't have to witness the misery and suffering they orchestrated and unleashed on so many people, including their own countrymen. Schirach didn't have to watch the Hitler Youth boys lying in the dirt, having sacrificed themselves, their youthful idealism and fervour hijacked and misused. What did Göring know of the steps at Mauthausen? The trials were a symbolic way to make these men face what they had done, look upon your work and despair. But West has a different opinion. The decision that she seemed to admire and approve the most, and to consider, I quote, a step farther down the road to civilization, was the acquittal the German admirals received in regards to the charge of violating the Naval Protocol of 1936, namely that they had ordered their submarines to attack all merchant ships without warning and not stop to save the survivors. Admiral Nimitz pointed out that the Allies, such as the British and the Americans, had committed exactly the same offence during the war. This technique has a name, tu quoque, which is Latin for you too, as in you did this too, so you have lost the moral high ground here. The reason was that the protocol was rather unrealistic to begin with. A submarine's greatest strength is its stealth. if forced to stay around after striking in order to fish out any survivors, exposing itself to danger from sea and air, then that beats the point of having them in the first place. West considered this particular acceptance of the Allies of their failings and the subsequent acquittal of the admirals as the most important thing that happened at Nuremberg, and was disappointed that it seemed to go by unnoticed. Even today, the Memoriam Nuremberg Trials, the documentation center housed in the former Palace of Justice where the trials took place, only has a small corner dedicated to this achievement. Or at least, that is how it was when I visited some years ago. You've probably wondered why the essay is titled Greenhouse with Cyclamen. Bit of an odd title for a series which concerns itself so much with the Nuremberg trials. You see, West and many of her fellow journalists were lodging in a villa outside Nuremberg, which coincidentally belonged to the Faber-Castell family. Yes, the ones with the office and art supplies. And close to that villa was a greenhouse. Inside, there was a man who was growing these beautiful cyclamen in pots. Beautiful, healthy plants with enormous flowers. I told you the Germans were great gardeners. He was growing them so he could sell them to whoever had money to buy them, which at that point were only the occupiers. And he seems to have been quite successful in his enterprise, for his flowers were often bought as souvenirs. According to West, he did not concern himself with the trial, with what was going on a larger scale in his country. He only wanted to know how long the trial will continue, and if more people will arrive for the sentencing, because that meant he could find more clients for his gorgeous creations. West initially did not seem to see much in that man, and turned his little endeavor into a metaphor. His lack of interest in anything but in the growing of more cyclamen troubled her, because she saw in it the blind drive that Germany had before the war. She writes that he terrified because his absorption in industry left a vacuum in his mind which sooner or later would be filled. If no religion or philosophy or art came to bind this man's imagination to reality, then the empty space would be flooded with fantasy, which would set him at odds with life. Above the greenhouse, the Schloss had soared like a huge doll's house, designed to house all the characters of Grimm's fairy tales. And some of those tales are very brutal. When men do not put away childish things in time, they turn on their tracks and seek the sources of death, such as the Nazis unsealed for them. This was only 1946. After such a storm, fear and worry were floating phantom-wise in the collective subconscious. If Germany had done this once, well, it might do it again. As understandable as that sentiment might be, I always thought the metaphor was deeply unfair to that man. There he was, in a country that was a ruin, where people were succumbing to disease and starvation, where endless rows of gaunt, empty-eyed refugees streamed through the rubble of the cities, where hope, like everything else, was in short supply. And yet, he had found a way to survive. He had put his mind and body to work and created something to sustain him, all from a handful of seeds. He was mostly alone in this. His only aid was an 11-year-old girl who occasionally came by to help him. That kind of industriousness is not mindless. At ground zero, it's hard to care about anything except your next meal. How extraordinary that he had found a way to start this enterprise in a country where there was nothing left. He only had one leg. He hobbled on his crutches around the greenhouse, patiently watering his cyclamen, feeding wood to the oven, peering at his seedlings. He was indeed a metaphor for Germany, but not in the way West thought in 1946. The Second World War displaced a great number of people. On top of the countless forced laborers who had been brought to work in the factories and farms of the Third Reich, there were Germans whose houses had been destroyed or who had fled the cities in fear of bombings or the Russians. These people are not just far away from home. For some, this home does not exist anymore. Their house, family, friends, job, community might not have survived the war. Many felt like their sense of purpose, security, any social standing they might have had, all vanished, sometimes overnight. In 1949, many of these so-called displaced persons were still living in terrible conditions. The Germans who were fortunate enough to still have a home and had a spare room were assigned one or more refugees. It was challenging. The strangers might have even been German, just like the hosts, but they often came from a completely different part of the country, spoke in a different dialect or accent, had a different confession, belonged perhaps to a different social class, all potential reasons for friction. Having to suddenly share living space with a stranger was uncomfortable for everyone, and the reactions were split. Some hosts resented it and tried everything to get rid of their unwanted guests. Some, especially farmers, accepted only refugees who could work on their farms and use them as free labor. Others accepted them and treated them with kindness and humanity. Gerhard Kraft, born 1941, living in Dossenheim by Heidelberg, recalls how there was one refugee for every 4 locals. A commission came to each house, requisitioned rooms and allocated refugees. They arrived the next day with a suitcase and wanted to move in. They wanted to sleep, cook, live, and had nothing. The atmosphere was very tense on both sides. The strangers also had different customs and their food smelled foreign. We had accommodated 3 people. There was also my aunt and her children, who had been deported from Austria, and later Uncle Martin, who had been a soldier. It became very crowded and aggressive, and there were constant arguments. Heinz Brockert from 1940, coming from somewhere close to Oldenburg, writes, "I remember exactly how we marched a long way from the railway station to the Einöd farm, to which we had been assigned, holding my mother's hand and singing, as was customary in our family. The farmer's wife came out with her 17-year-old son and told us that she couldn't take us because they were only prepared for one woman with one child. The son intervened and said in Low German, 'Mother, nimm sie, der Lütte ist so süß.' 'Mother, take them. The little one is so sweet.' The mother was persuaded to change her mind, so for 6 months we found a place in a shed that had been separated from the cowshed. No matter. We were safe, and a lifelong friendship began with the farmer's family." The country and its population, already profoundly weakened by war, was in great danger due to this endless influx of refugees. There was a very real fear that millions might perish due to starvation, disease, and inhumane living conditions. And so, in light of these circumstances, Germany's revival is the more astonishing, and West credits not the Allies, but the Germans for saving themselves and for knowing instinctively what kind of economy would be best for their country. It is hard to see how any but a speculative and uncurbed economy could have been flexible enough to assimilate the expellees and refugees and relieve the Allies of so much of their guilt. It is sobering to consider what would have happened in post-war Britain, which has about the same population as Western Germany, if 10 million people had been dumped in the country, with no more property than they could carry, and 1.5 million of these had immediately begun to draw unemployment benefits, while the rest competed with the Britons in the labour market. Funny enough, at this moment, the UK is on its way to finding out what happens in precisely this kind of situation. This miraculous change became apparent to West in the mid-1950s, when she was attending a Congress of Economists in Lucerne, Switzerland. The Americans were in top form and made a dazzling impression through their prosperous appearance. Fine suits, gold watches, expensive briefcases. In contrast, the others, such as the British, French, Italians, Dutch, and those from Scandinavian countries, looked decidedly modest, although West made sure to point out that none of them looked shabby. There was just no competing with the obvious wealth of the Americans. But then, on the 3rd day, the German officials arrived, and something incredible happened. Suit for suit, tie for tie, shirt for shirt, briefcase for briefcase, the Americans and the Germans were running level. Both had the best of everything, But the Germans had better than that. Their grooming spoke of a wealth of shaving sticks and brilliantine and toilet water in a country where, 4 years before, there had not been enough soap. Their confidence spoke of productiveness that had risen to 1.5 times what it had been before the war, with a standard of living only slightly below the British level. But the extravagant glory that shone from them came not from their prosperity, but from a conclusion which they were drawing from that prosperity, a conclusion that gave them a happiness which all people of our age lacked. She sees hope for the first time. It appears so unexpectedly in her story that it feels like it mirrors the surprise the rest of the world must have felt when they witnessed this miracle. What started as a story about death, the death revealed during the trials, the death of fascism and some of its perpetrators, ends as a story of rebirth. Finally, with the benefit of time, she understands what that one-legged gardener in Nuremberg really represented and gives him his due. She calls his greenhouse, in which he had tirelessly labored day after day, the only real building in Nuremberg. Something which struck me as particularly important was her commentary on the way misinformation regarding the trials was born and disseminated. Hans Fritzsche, 46-year-old at the time of the trials, had been Ministerialdirektor at the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda and one of the defendants to be acquitted, having been accused of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Fritzsche appeared to be just as surprised of the acquittal as he had been of having been placed on the bench of the accused. He hadn't really been that important, certainly not as important as the others, leading some to believe at the time that, with Goebbels gone, he was the next best thing the Allies could get their hands on. The jury had decided that there was not sufficient evidence available to convict Fritzsche of any charges, and so he was released. Later, Nuremberg prosecutor Alexander Hardy would point out that key evidence such as press directives was discovered much later, evidence that confirmed that Fritzsche not only knew about the atrocities happening under the National Socialist regime, but also that he had played a role in making them happen. So the suspicion of the Allies was not quite unfounded. West, however, writing in 1954, characterized Fritzsche's broadcasts as banal twitterings and considered him a mediocre, unremarkable man. Some retribution was doled out to him, however, as he was convicted under the denazification laws, classified as a major offender, and received the maximum penalty, but was a free man by 1950. That same year, he married a former colleague of his, Hildegard Springer, and published a book under her name, with the not-so-subtle title The Sword in the Scales, before dying of lung cancer in 1953. West points out that this book contains a chapter which was particularly rife with misinformation and sets about to fact-check it. In chapter 27, Funk and the Reichsbank, Fritzsche writes about Walter Funk, the president of the Reichsbank, who reluctantly admitted during the trial that he had accepted from the SS enormous bags containing jewelry and thousands of gold teeth. There's no prize in guessing where the SS harvested that particular bounty. Fritzsche writes about the moment they all saw the film that showcased these objects. We saw projected on the screen before us the horrible pictures of what the Americans found in the strong room of the Frankfurt offices of the Reichsbank. We saw soldiers enter the building and big safes swing open. Huge, tightly packed bags with the imprint Deutsche Reichsbank dropped to the floor. Powerful men needed all their strength to lift them on the tables. Then the seals were solemnly broken and the contents poured out. Rings, bracelets, earrings, trinkets, jewelry of every conceivable kind, from simple brooches to great tiaras, coins, banknotes, studs, sleeve links, and above all, false and gold-capped teeth in their thousands. We sat flabbergasted. Fritzsche points out that an official of the Reichsbank in Frankfurt had mentioned that when the Americans occupied the city, the entire bank was empty and contained no valuables, and that he had handed it over to the Americans as such. So how could they have found the bags there when the bank was empty when they arrived? Fritzsche makes the claim that a few days after the Americans took over the bank, several trucks carrying the grisly loot arrived, and the bank was demanded to produce empty sacks marked with their emblem. The bags were then filled with the loot, neatly placed inside the bank, and then the film was made. Was it all a big conspiracy? Well, no. West explains that the precious objects had not been found in the bank, but hidden in the Merker salt mines. The American soldiers who discovered them also found clues that they had been temporarily stored in the Reichsbank in Frankfurt. To have such an enormous quantity of precious metals lying around was not feasible. It had to be immediately stored somewhere safe. And what safer place than the vaults of a bank? So they were quickly brought to the Reichsbank in Frankfurt and filmed for documentation purposes. West explains further that the whole story was based on a single slip made by Mr. Dodd, the American prosecutor. In alluding to this film, he spoke of materials that were found in your Reichsbank vaults a year ago. He either meant to say photographed instead of found, or suffered a confusion which was purely momentary. For he did not dispute the statement given in evidence by Poole. I had the impression that the things of which we are talking had been put there expressly for the purpose of taking the film, although he interrupted to correct various statements made about the film. There was, of course, an initial improbability in the story, which should have discredited its starkness. It is unlikely that the Americans would have allowed Germans to be present while they faked a film. It was also incomprehensible why they should have faked a film about these deposits when they had 2 directors of the Reichsbank and 2 of its officials to give lengthy and detailed testimony regarding them, and when there was a large amount of documentary evidence. This last was extremely voluminous, owing to the circumstances of the case. The SS account was lodged in an imaginary depositor called Max Heiliger, and there were 27 deliveries of the blood-stained loot. The jewelry was sent by the Reichsbank to the Berlin pawn shop, and the gold and dentures and spectacle frames went to the State Mint to be melted down. Later, the pawn shop and State Mint were glutted and could not handle any more stuff, and I have to stop here. How many gold teeth does it take to make the State Mint full? How many people? There's a bit of National Socialist math for you. Later, the pawn shop and the State Mint were glutted and could not handle any more stuff, so the goods were not unpacked when they arrived at the Reichsbank, but were stored as they had been sent. All this involved a massive correspondence which was found by the Allies. There was therefore no need to bolster up the case against Funk by forging a film, particularly as it was not used as proof of any charge, but was simply shown to the witnesses in order that they should testify whether they recognized those goods as typical deposits made by the SS. This is clearly a matter of great frustration for her. Books like Fritzsche's are a slow-moving poison. There is no telling how many people read it since its publication, and the percentage of those readers who are willing to, or even had the possibility to read the 22 volumes containing the trial documents and catch the vital clues that were left out, contained in 3 of those 22 volumes, is all but guaranteed to be insignificant. To put it simply, it's a gargantuan task. And unless you're a historian or have a particular interest in a topic and are willing to devote a considerable amount of time and some money to it, you're probably not going to read everything. And even if you do, you start to realize that you'd need more information. You start reading biographies of the men on the dock, you start reading books like Fritzsche's, accounts by journalists like West, you start reading about the regime and the war, and you end up casting such a wide net out there to understand the context of the trials that it becomes quite life-consuming. It's like an iceberg. So when misinformation such as Fritzsche's appears, the amount of work it would take for someone who is not present at the trial and wasn't closely acquainted with its ins and outs would require such an immense amount of time, patience and dedication that would become prohibitive for most people. But the misinformation is still around, now more than ever. West played her part in fighting it by publishing her essays. But what can we do? A way to combat this is to make the documents widely available online for free, so that anyone who may be interested can be granted the chance to see the information in its pure form. Steps towards achieving this goal have been made in the late 90s by the Harvard Law School through their Nuremberg Trials project. Their goal is to make the around 1 million pages of transcripts and trial exhibits in their collection available online. The materials of 7 of the 13 trials have been digitized until now. Their project offers multiple ways to search through these documents by name or by keyword, find related materials, photographs, and does a good job at making things much easier for us than it has been for those who came before us. For example, here is an extract from a set of commentaries on Nazi leaders by Schacht, on Göring's immoral character, ignorance in economic subjects, political intrigues against other leaders, and fear of Hitler. I consider this work commendable and important, which is why I'm going to share the link to the project in the video description. Or feel free to Google Harvard Law School, the Nuremberg Trials project. It's worth a visit. What you have just finished listening to was a little different from my usual style. When I work on a project, I can usually see an overarching theme, an angle, a thesis that eventually comes to me. But this time, I wanted to share just some bits and pieces that I found interesting and thought-provoking. It came in a less structured form, was a bit of a ramble, but I hope it surprised, informed, and perhaps even inspired you to take action and look through the files of the Nuremberg Trials project. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you in my next project.